The following video is part 1 of a 6-part retrospective covering the entire Paper Mario series. You can use a playlist featured in the description to watch the available parts in order. Also, spoiler warning for every game in the Paper Mario series. What is Paper Mario? That's not some deep philosophical question, nor is it something that can be answered with a quick Google search. Rather, it's the question at the heart of a series with an incredibly controversial identity crisis. This identity crisis being the root cause of an exhausted fanbase and ongoing debate that has persisted to this day. To say it's complicated would be a bit of an understatement. From the perspective of an outsider looking in, it's strange to think that a series of spin-off Mario games would be the subject of so many heated and passionate rants online, but that's because Paper Mario, in the eyes of its fans, is something incredibly special. At least it used to be. To me personally, Paper Mario holds a lot of significance, as it was the series that introduced me to Mario as a whole. While I wasn't necessarily there for the series at inception, I've nevertheless followed it since the late 2000s, right as things got a little dicey. While I've seen a lot of the same general attitude towards this series, I've also seen a lot of differing opinions as well, with there even being people who love the games that a lot of the hardcore fans seem to be furious at. The journey that this series has undertaken has been incredibly fascinating to see unfold, no pun intended, especially now that the modern games have cultivated an audience in and of themselves. It seems like the discourse around Paper Mario will continue to be heated for as long as the internet exists. No matter what direction the next game in the series decides to take, this controversy will forever stick with the series, ingrained in its DNA from this point forward. Now that 2 years have passed since the release of the most recent entry in the series, Paper Mario: The Origami King, I think it's time to take a look back at the entire franchise and uncover what it is about everyone's favorite paperboy that's become so divisive. Figure out what makes the series tick, and revisit the so-called low points in the franchise to see if they're as bad as they've been made out to be. Just how damaging was Sticker Star? Why is the Thousand Year Door seen as the gold standard? Do these new games in the series emphasize paper a bit too much? Where will they go from here? I'm not entirely sure, but that's exactly why we're here. Well, actually, the real reason I'm here is to collect some MacGuffins. See, I've heard stories of the 6 paper hearts, and the power that can be harnessed when all 6 are collected might just be exactly what I need to help my little egg friend hatch. I've been using a lot of resources to keep this egg surviving for the last several months, and honestly, I need it to hatch ASAP. So this mission is vital to my survival in the mysterious void that I'm trapped in. How do I collect the paper hearts? By doing a Paper Mario series retrospective, of course. 6 games, 6 hearts, and everything I need to do that is in this book. Cheeto Cat, you brought the book, right? Thank you very much. I hope this works. Hi, my name is JJ the Zillennial, and I love Paper Mario. But what does that statement really mean? That's the question I want to get to the heart of. But answering that question is gonna require answering a lot of these other questions as well. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the entire Paper Mario series, discussing each game with an appropriate amount of detail, giving each entry a chance to speak for itself, all in the goal of making sense of this chaotic discussion. For those who are new to the series, I'll provide all the necessary context to understand the story. And for longtime fans who have their own opinions, I hear you. I too have a lot of complicated feelings towards the Paper Mario series, and this might just be the only way for me to make sense of them all. This one's personal, as these games mean a lot to me, and my hope is that this will be a therapeutic experience. By the time we're done discussing the franchise, I won't even be the same person. You'll hopefully see what I mean when we get there, so grab a snack, get comfy, and buckle up, because today, Cheeto Cat and myself are embarking on a quest, and you, my fellow Zillennials, are invited. So let me tell you a story. This is a Paper Mario series retrospective. Today, I am going to tell you the story of Paper Mario. An awfully long time ago, in a distant land known as Nintendo, a franchise known as Super Mario Bros. Had become an inescapable worldwide phenomenon. Though these games were primarily 2D platformers at the time, Nintendo wasn't afraid to try out different genres. But there was one genre in particular that would go on to spawn some of the most iconic games bearing the Mario name. Our story truly begins in the year 1996 with the release of a little game called Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars. The legend of Paper Mario starts here.
Legend of the... No, it's just Super Mario RPG.
Oh my god! Before we can talk about Paper Mario, I think it's just as important that we spend at least a little bit of time talking about Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars, the predecessor to the entire Paper Mario franchise, and a game whose foundation became the jumping off point. So imagine, it's the 90s. Mario's a pretty big deal. At this point, he's starting to prove that he can tackle just about any genre and do it pretty well. Sports, puzzle games, NASCAR, Mario teaches typing. There is nothing that this man can't do. So on paper, the idea of putting this guy in an RPG seems like a crazy idea, but then you really start thinking about it and it's actually f***ing brilliant. This all came about because Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix today, the big daddy honchos of the RPG genre in the early 90s, wanted to create a game that would appeal to the West. Even to this day, with the context of other collaborations that Nintendo's done, it's still crazy to think that Nintendo and Squaresoft collabed on a project like this. But the result was Super Mario RPG, a true fusion between your standard Final Fantasy and the wacky world of Mario. And it's even crazier to think that this one game would go on to spawn not one, but two separate ongoing series of Mario RPG games. Those being the Mario and Luigi series, and of course, the subject of today's video, the Paper Mario series. This right here, it's not either of those two things, but it does serve as the nexus point that kind of grandfathered these other two into existence. Hey, that sounds kind of familiar. This won't be a fully in-depth analysis of Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars, seeing as how it's technically not a Paper Mario game, but we should at least cover the basics since Paper Mario owes a lot of its design and basically its very existence to the Super Nintendo classic. Released in 1996 at the tail end of the Super Nintendo's life, Super Mario RPG is exactly what it sounds like. It's Mario in an RPG. You play as Mario, embarking on a quest to collect the magical MacGuffins and take down a big bad final boss after several hours of leveling up and turn-based battles. Even back in 1996, the idea seemed kind of strange, but little did Nintendo fans know, Super Mario RPG would be heralded as one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and for good reason, as it seamlessly combines both concepts into a cohesive whole. Having been worked on by Squaresoft, the game has a lot in common with its contemporaries from the time. Turn-based battles, party members, leveling up, items, all that jazz. Of course, what separates this game from other RPGs of the time is how they infused a healthy dosage of Mario. And this is much more than a mere cosmetic difference. Turn-based battles and mountains of text and complicated systems can be off-putting for a lot of people, but by adding Mario elements to this game, it's able to strike a middle ground that's more inviting to novices, though it can and still will kick your ass if you're not ready. It definitely kicked my ass more than a few times. There are surface level things like a world map, Goombas and Koopa enemies, Mario using a hammer and jump as his primary attacks instead of a sword, and using mushrooms and fire flowers as items, but the changes go far beyond that. Instead of random encounters, you initiate battle as soon as you make contact with an enemy on the overworld. Yeah, they just love to zip around like madmen. Although with how erratic a lot of these enemies move, it can still feel like a random encounter sometimes, and you'll still find yourself in battles that you don't necessarily want to, but you at least have a chance to avoid them and it doesn't feel completely random like it does in other RPGs. Get into battle and you'll notice a few other changes as well. Rather than just selecting your attack and being done with it, Super Mario RPG has timed button presses that allow you to deal more damage depending on how good your timing is, which makes combat itself a little bit more tactile and active. I would argue that this feature is what distinguishes this game from other RPGs a bit more than some of the other aspects. The game is hard, and I found myself needing to grind at certain points, but the balancing is overall more lenient than your typical Final Fantasy from the time. At least that's what it felt like to me. There's a lot of complexity to the battle system, but on the whole, it's been made a bit easier for younger players to comprehend. We have fun little action set pieces to break up the pacing and keep battles from getting too repetitive. Rather than having a basic Mario must get to Bowser to rescue Peach storyline, this game shook things up by having the big bad final boss role be usurped by a big ol' anime sword with eyes. Peach and Bowser become full-blown party members. Mario RPG also introduced a lot of original characters that have never made appearances in Mario games since, which is pretty sad. The beloved puppet boy Gino that everyone desperately wants to be in Smash Bros comes from this game, and the fact that he's had such a legacy is a testament to the story, characters, and just the worlds that was created for this game. The writing and dialogue is chock full of goofy humor, fun gags, and even some touching moments. And despite the fact that Mario can't speak, he has his fair share of emotive and expressive moments. So this is the part where I confess that I had never played Super Mario RPG until I decided to start working on this retrospective video series. And experiencing it for the first time definitely opened my eyes to why this game is such a beloved classic. But I also had a rough time with certain aspects of the game. For one, I personally hate the isometric perspective. It makes a lot of sense with the artistic choices that they made, and it's hard to imagine the game looking any other way, but controlling Mario with this perspective is kind of a nightmare, especially when you have to do precise platforming diagonally. Sections like this one right here were pretty frustrating, and the challenge may very well be intentional, but it didn't feel very comfortable to play. On a similar note, I also wasn't very keen on the game's visual style. I'm sorry for coming off so harsh to such a legendary game, but if I'm being completely honest, I think the game looks kind of ugly. Rather than using a more traditional sprite-based system, they went in the same direction as games like Donkey Kong Country, using pre-rendered graphics. And you know, when it comes to the designs of enemies and characters, it looks fine. My big gripes visually stem from the solid colored backgrounds and the weird shading choices in some places, plus the fact that some assets just don't look like they fit in with the rest of the visual style. I'm sure it looked better in the 90s on a CRT television, but even then, I don't think it's aged quite as gracefully as the rest of the SNES catalog. Even so, I can still appreciate the artistic direction, and there are definitely some scenes and moments where the style really gets to shine. Super Mario RPG, while definitely being easier than your average Final Fantasy, was still a game that I had a few passing moments of frustration with, namely the amount of battles that I had to participate in to maintain a good level, and how difficult it could often be to avoid initiating battle in the first place. Also, just a random little pet peeve, I think it's pretty anticlimactic that Mario gets his iconic hammer by stealing it from a random hammer bro. Paper Mario sort of retcons that, so I'm gonna go with my preferred headcanon for how he gets this item. All in all, Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is a brilliant game that serves as an incredible foundation for two amazing series of Mario RPGs to come. And while I didn't quite fall in love with it as a first-time player in 2022, I can absolutely appreciate what Nintendo and Squaresoft had created, and I'm glad that I finally experienced it. If anything, I'm grateful for this game spawning some of my favorite video games ever made. So, with our prologue out of the way, let's finally start talking about Paper Mario.
He has new enemies with funky attacks! But will he save the princess? Woo! Find out in Paper Mario!
RPGs have a bit of a reputation. While the genre has in recent years become popular enough that Nintendo Directs seem to consist mostly of them, it's still a type of game that's looked at as niche compared to your average Mario or Zelda or Smash Brothers, the other big exception being Pokemon, an RPG that's very mainstream. But if you ask the average Nintendo fan if they've played any JRPGs, the response you'll likely get is, "I can't get into RPGs, but I do like Paper Mario." Baby's first RPG is what many have dubbed this title, and while that statement is largely true, it's hardly a bad thing. And it is this very reason that Paper Mario has managed to successfully bridge the gap between casual and hardcore players. The story of how this game came to be is not only fascinating, but incredibly relevant to our overall discussion of the identity of the series. Let's jump back a few years. Super Mario RPG was quite a success, so logically, you would expect Paper Mario RPG 2 to be in the works, and it was. Development of this title began before Mario RPG even hit store shelves, but in life, things don't always work out as expected. So basically, it all starts with some Nintendo executive being like, "Ayo Shiggy, we want to make Mario RPG 2, but Squaresoft, they don't want to make games with us anymore. Damn it. Hey, Intelligent Systems. We need a new Mario RPG so that we can make fat stacks of paper. You got any ideas? Paper. Okay, so in Japan, this game's not called Paper Mario, it's called Mario Story over there. But Paper Mario would eventually become the name of the series in Japan after this title. Hey, that's kind of an important point. You might want to keep that in mind for later. Released in the year 2000 over in Japan and in 2001 for everyone else, this was one of the last games to grace the Nintendo 64, with Squaresoft no longer having a positive relationship with Nintendo after the whole PlayStation Final Fantasy VII debacle that there are plenty of good videos about online if you're interested. Intelligent Systems had to step in and take the reins. Intelligent Systems are best known as the people who make Fire Emblem, a series which I've tried to get into many times and just can't, though maybe the Switch titles will change my mind. In early development, Paper Mario was designed under the pretext that it was going to be Super Mario RPG 2, and it kept that title for a very long time during development, but for the final product, they decided to rebrand to the game that we know today as a way to distance itself from what they had created with Square Enix, essentially creating a new series which took heavy inspiration from Mario RPG. We have a lot of the same surface level things, like the fact that it's an RPG with Mario characters, star MacGuffins, jumps, and hammers. We also have timed button presses, returning items, and the same approach to world building and original characters, though none of Mario RPG's original characters return. Don't make the mistake of thinking that these two games are basically the same, because while very similar, they're also incredibly distinct. If Super Mario RPG is an RPG with Mario elements, Paper Mario is a Mario game with RPG elements. Okay, I know it sounds weird and perhaps a little confusing, but as we compare the differences between Paper Mario and the game that inspired it, I'm hoping it'll be easier for you to get where I'm coming from with that statement. To me, Paper Mario, while not the first game in the series that I ever played, is an incredibly special title that fills me with a special kind of warmth. It's a game that tends to be overshadowed by its critically acclaimed sequel, and fair enough, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door is a special game, and I'll have a lot to say about it when we get to it, but for now, let's set the scene for the very first game in this beloved series, Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64. Like the opening chapter of a storybook, we learn about a mysterious place known as Star Haven and the star spirits that guard the Star Rod, a magical wand that grants the star spirits power to grant wishes. Of course, this being a Mario game, Bowser shows up and steals the MacGuffin, locks away the star spirits, and sets off to take over the world. With that, we cut to our title screen. After naming your save file, the true start of the game begins. We open up with Mario and Luigi hanging out in their house. Princess Peach sends them a letter to inform them that she's throwing a party.
Dear Mario, do not come to the castle. I've baked an absolute dogshit cake.
And the bros are invited to attend. But once they get there, Bowser appears, lifts the entire castle into the sky, and murks Mario. Cue the title as a deceased Mario descends from the heavens. The star spirits use what little of their remaining power they have to bring Mario back from the brink of death, and entrust him with the mission of traveling across the lands of the Mushroom Kingdom to rescue the star spirits, get back the Star Rod, and travel to Bowser's castle for a rematch so he can rescue Princess Peach. With a consistent crew of allies joining Mario on his quest, he visits many strange lands adjacent to the Mushroom Kingdom with the goal of defeating each area's boss and rescuing all of the star spirits. It's a jam-packed adventure which is split pretty evenly between overworld exploration, puzzle solving, and of course, turn-based battles. I would argue that Paper Mario puts more of an emphasis on overworld exploration compared to Super Mario RPG, as I feel like you're able to do a lot more in this game's overworld. But while that is the case, this game's battle mechanics need to have a decent discussion, since that's one of this game's biggest highlights and something that truly sets it apart from its contemporaries in the same genre. On the surface, this system looks an awful lot like any other RPG, Super Mario RPG in particular, complete with turn-based battles initiated by making contact with enemies in the overworld. But as you continue your adventure, the more distinct flavors of Mario start to become very apparent. Tastes like spaghetti. Mario RPG had hints of Mario and streamlined a few RPG isms here and there, but at its core, it was still cut from the same molds that produced other popular RPGs of the time. Once Paper Mario's battle mechanics really start to come into their own, you realize that there's simply nothing quite like it. For starters, the numbers have all been scaled down drastically. Most RPGs have you dealing out attacks with up to hundreds, if not thousands of units of damage, and you likewise have HP counts that can skyrocket into some pretty large numbers. But in Paper Mario, you start off with a mere 10 HP, and attacks being dealt and received, at least at the start, only take off a single hit point. You also won't randomly miss attacks like you would in other RPGs, though you do have tools that can make it so that enemies will sometimes miss attacking you, but that's something that you specifically have to opt into, and we'll get into the system that allows for that to be possible in just a moment. In Paper Mario, what you see is what you get. And it's a lot easier to keep track of than defeating enemies gains you star points, this game's version of experience points, and at 100 you level up. More powerful enemies give you more, weaker enemies don't give you as much. The more that you level up, the less star points that you gain from defeating the same enemy type, until eventually that enemy just doesn't give you any star points whatsoever, which kind of makes those battles feel a bit like a waste of time, but whatever. Paper Mario has a different approach to leveling up, as doing so doesn't mean increasing a varied number of stats, and it doesn't even increase your base attack power. Base attack damage increases at specific points in the story after you acquire specific items. When you level up, you specifically choose which of 3 attributes you want to improve. HP, or health points, the amount of health that you have. FP, or flower points, basically the stuff that lets you choose extra powerful attacks. And BP, or badge points, which lets you equip more and more badges, allowing for more offensive and defensive options. HP and FP will go up exactly by 5 each time, and BP will only go up by 3. You start the game with 10 HP, 5 FP, and 3 BP, and by the time I got to the final boss, my stats looked something like this. These endgame numbers are a lot closer to the kinds that you might see at the beginning of a standard RPG, or maybe they're still less, I don't know. The largest number of damage dealt with a single attack that I ever saw was something like 12, if I recall correctly. By default, the options that you have available to you in battle are limited, though not in a bad way. They're just a lot more straightforward than what's typical of most RPGs. You can attack using either a jump or hammer attack, use one of your Star Spirit powers, we'll talk about that later, use an item, or make a tactical decision like doing nothing, fleeing, or swapping your partner. Depending on how certain enemies are positioned or which type of enemy you're facing, you'll need to choose the right attack type accordingly. With jumps, you can choose any enemy to jump on, but if they have a spike on their head, you'll take damage when you make contact. Hammers mitigate this, but you can't use them on airborne enemies, and you can only attack whoever's in the front. Luckily, these are far from the only attacks at your disposal, and there are ways to augment these attacks so that you can get more out of them. And that's all thanks to badges. Badges and action commands are where the real depth of this battle system comes into play, and you'll definitely want to give that badge point counter some love and attention, because they allow you to equip more badges, and more badges means you can do a lot more in battle. Most common and obvious are the badges that allow for extra attack options, things like the multi-bounce badge that allows you to attack multiple enemies at once, or the power smash badge that allows you to attack an enemy and deal even more damage than you typically would. As I said earlier, jumps allow you to target any enemy that isn't on the ceiling, whereas hammer attacks will only work on the enemy on the ground, which is closest to you. But equip the Quake badge option and bada boom bada bing, you can damage everyone on the ground and the ceiling. Or how about a badge that lets you fling your hammer at the enemy? Bada boom. How about a badge that lets you jump on fire enemies or ones with spikes? Let's not forget about the ones that pierce defense, or inflict debuffs or ailments on enemies, or perhaps a badge that lets you use 2 items in a single turn. Be warned though, any attack that you gain through badges are attacks that use flower points, so you want to make sure that you're also giving your time and attention to that counter as well. Because listen, you start off with a measly 5, and you're not going to get a whole lot done with just 5. Timed button presses, which made their debut in Mario RPG, have evolved into action commands, and are even more interactive than this game's predecessor, with the addition of button prompts that indicate when a move should be pulled off. It's much more than just mashing or timing a button press. There are other commands, like holding back your analog stick, holding A, and rhythmically timing out multiple presses. Action commands are awesome for a few key reasons. For one, they give the player something tactile to engage with, and that's really important when your average Joe sees JRPGs as just sitting through menus, the game. It's simple, but this change really makes combat a lot more engaging than it otherwise would be, and it helps to keep me from dreading entering battles unintentionally. They feel a lot more like minigames. Most action commands are pretty easy, and I pretty much never miss them, though a few do present a bit more of a challenge, which are usually more high-risk, high-reward types of attacks. Also, playing this through Nintendo Switch Online certainly didn't help, but it is still playable. Thousand Year Door improves in this area quite a bit with more dynamic and advanced action commands, many of which are a lot more difficult to pull off. The penalty for missing an action command is a significant reduction in damage dealt, or you receive full damage if you're using an action command to guard, which is also another neat thing that you can do. Typically, missing an action command means that your damage will be reduced in half, though it's not always half, it depends on which kind of attack you're doing. You see the most variety in action commands with the different partners that you can choose from. Oh yeah, partners. So as you go along your adventure, you recruit a colorful cast of characters to your party. Each one functions similarly to a traditional party member in a different RPG, but they also differ wildly. In Mario RPG, each party member was a fleshed out character that had access to most of the same functions as one another, Mario included, and you could have up to 3 active at a time. Here, when it comes to Mario's partners, you have Mario, and you have a single partner that can be active at any given time, and they don't have as many options. You can choose from one of a handful of attacks, sometimes defensive options depending on the partner, or you can switch to a different partner, or do nothing. That's about it. Partners don't even have their own set of HP. Most enemy attacks focus exclusively on Mario, and rarely do partners ever take damage. Whenever they do take damage, they're out for the next couple of turns instead. Partners also have utility in the overworld, granting Mario various different powers like crossing large gaps, blowing up walls Zelda style, giving hints, and swimming, among many other things. Because of how limited they are, you're mostly going to be relying on Mario and his set of abilities in battle. They're mostly there to support and help you. The partner that's out when you're exploring the overworld also carries into battle, and swapping for a different one takes a partner's turn, unless you equip the Quick Change badge. Honestly, this is my favorite badge in the whole game. I love this one. Expensive to equip, but worth it. You also have items, as mentioned earlier, and these come in offensive and defensive flavors, though I don't think the offensive ones are all too useful outside of the early game, but anything that heals or gives you more FP, always good to have on hand. Lastly are the Star Spirits, which are pretty useful, but also use their own dedicated resource that slowly recharges with each turn. And I mean very slowly. You're able to spend a turn recharging it a lot more at once, but I pretty much never did this. Also, Mario's the only one of the two that can. After each chapter, you gain a new Star Spirit and your meter increases. I mostly just used Starstorm, which does hella damage to all enemies, and Smooch, which gives Mario 20 HP back. These don't have any action commands associated with them, so I mostly treated them like items. Altogether, with these elements taken into consideration, the battle system of Paper Mario is easy to understand, but has many layers of complexity to dig into for those seeking it out. It mostly comes down to figuring out what kind of badge configuration you want. And because of that, the game does a really good job of catering to different playstyles. Battles feel more like puzzles in a sense, as while the goal is always to take down the enemies, there are a number of ways that you can go about doing that. It's all about managing the different resources and assessing how far away you are from being able to replenish said resources. If you're close to leveling up, maybe you play a bit more risky since you know that you're going to be able to replenish HP, FP, and star power. Or maybe you just run away. That's also an option, though it does come with its own action command, so you better mash that A button like there's no tomorrow. When you successfully escape battle, you get to continue exploring the overworld. Which, speaking of which, how does Mario control outside of battle? Pretty okay, I'd say. It's important to note that the paper version of Mario, he's not as athletic as he is in his platforming games, but he still has his recognizable trait of jumping, and you can also use your hammer at will. It's a very short jump, which is odd considering how massive his leaps can be in battle, but it's not that big of a deal. You get used to it pretty quickly. Both jumping and hammering are things that you do in battle, and they also have practical uses in the overworld. But here, let me show you something that's pretty neat. This game is f***ing brilliant. And you don't just use jumping for platforming and hammering for breaking blocks on occasion. No, you can initiate battles by attacking enemies this way too, and doing so will give you an automatic extra attack right at the start of the battle, which is frankly genius. And I keep being blown away by the many smart decisions on the part of the developers. But be warned, because you can also receive attacks as well. Get hit by an enemy on the overworld and you'll start the battle by taking damage. Like with Mario RPG, random encounters basically don't exist in this game. All enemies that you see on the overworld are tangible and can be interacted with, merging both Overworld Exploration and battle into a seamless experience. Boss fights are the only battles that you're typically being forced to get into. Otherwise, any battle with a normal enemy is optional. Enemies don't move with the same speed that they did in Mario RPG, so it's a lot easier to not accidentally get into a battle that you don't want to. And to make it a little easier to avoid enemies, Mario can just turn into a fucking Beyblade with this little spinny move. It's a small thing, but the spin dash makes overworld traversal a lot more fun than it otherwise would be, and you can even equip a badge to make it even more intense. Overworld Exploration on the whole is pretty enjoyable, with a fixed camera perspective that gives the game an almost 2.5D sort of feel. There's no camera manipulation here, so get that thought out of your head, bucko. You'll find your fair share of goodies in the overworld too, like badges, items, star pieces, and coins, which it wouldn't be a Mario game without. With this being an RPG, coins don't just give you extra lives, rather they're currency, as one might expect. Star pieces are also a different specific type of currency that you can find out in the overworld, or by doing this little quiz with this little worm guy. I don't know what his deal is, but he's adorable. I like his little wiggly tail and his stripes. Do a quiz and you'll get a star piece, wahoo! Anyway, you take your star pieces to this character who will sell you a various assortment of badges, and that's pretty neat. As for your coins, you can spend said currency at places like Toad Town, the hub of the game. The central area is largely locked off from the player at the start of the game, but little by little more begins to open up, allowing you to access the later chapters as well as the many resources on offer. Things like a fortune teller who gives hints on what to do next, shops that sell you items, beds to rest and heal, a post office, Lil Oink's vending machine, which is a thing that exists and is kind of a big waste of time. There's also Tasty's house, where you can cook up your items into some different items that are sometimes better than what you started with, though not always.
That is fucking disgusting.
Toad Town is quaint, but charming. Though it isn't especially large, it feels surprisingly expansive, and it even has its own underground labyrinth with things to do in between each chapter, including recurring boss fights with a giant blooper. As for the worlds you visit in the main chapters of the game, I'm happy to report that these are solid. The game's environments do tend to fall back on established Mario conventions quite a bit, but I also feel like the game deserves some slack, given it's the first in this particular series. And within these basic themes and a pretty basic story that's less ambitious than that of Super Mario RPG, it's still able to be engaging and varied. The prologue sees Mario befriending a village of Goombas and having his first scrap with a recurring rival, Junior Troopa. That's right. The very first thing that Mario does as soon as he gets his first hammer is beat the shit out of a newborn child. In the prologue, Mario befriends Goombario, who becomes the first of many partners to join Mario on his quest. He's not a very powerful character, but he is able to give you information on enemies, such as their weak points and what their HP values are, so he does have some uses. He also has unique text for every single enemy type in the game, so there's a lot of optional dialogue as well. I say this as somebody that basically never used Goombario. I'm sorry, buddy, it's not your fault. I just don't like you very much. After returning to Toad Town and getting the quest proper, Mario sets off for Chapter 1, which is your run-of-the-mill grasslands that are what you would typically expect of for a Mario game. Though this chapter is helped by how entertaining its antagonists are. Are they Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoffs? Sure, but they're still fun to watch. Here you befriend Cooper, a Koopa who's more useful in battle and in the overworld, as he can damage blocks, get things that are far away from you, and also does more damage and just has better attacks in general. Sorry, Goombario. Near the end of the chapter, you also befriend Bombette, a Bob-omb who, get this, explodes.
Hey, you. Finally awake.
It all culminates with a face-off against the Ninja Turtles, who are very incompetent at what they do, but entertaining to watch nonetheless. Chapter 2 is a trek through the desert, a setting that I'm naturally inclined to not feel very positively about as a native Arizonan, but here we meet Parakarry, a mail delivering paratroopa whose whole thing is that he dropped the mail that he was supposed to be delivering and is joining you because he'll hopefully find his letters along the way. I mean, sure. There's this really funny section where you can just lie to this character Buzzer and bypass the boss battle that you would normally be expected to do. But I'm a good citizen, so I went back and murdered him properly.
Let's kill him properly this time.
Also, I wanted the star points that bosses typically give you, so I figured I might as well. You go from an American West-inspired desert to a more Middle Eastern-inspired town, and you dig up a pyramid Indiana Jones style where you fight Tutton Koopa, a coward who tried to intimidate you the moment that you entered and kinda doesn't know what he's doing.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Chapter 3 is the spooky chapter, where we're introduced to Lady Bo, my personal favorite partner in the entire game. In a bit of a twist, she's the one holding the Star Spirit hostage and forces you into a deal where you have to assist her in defeating the boss of the area, Tubba Blubba, who eats ghosts. Okay, but I'm genuinely really curious about what they taste like. Or do they just have no flavor but like a really good texture? I don't know, something to think about. Tubba Blubba is invincible, but by sneaking around his home, you learn that his heart is being kept away from his body, and that the heart itself is the weak point. Bada boom bada bing, you use Lady Bo to slap the shit out of some dudes and you save the ghosts. I kinda feel like maybe I wanna be on the receiving end of that attack. Anyway, you got a new boo in your party, hurrah! And she can also turn you invisible. That's cool. Chapter 4 is one of the more interesting, but also kind of controversial chapters in the game. You get back to Toad Town and notice a bunch of Shy Guys running amok. After doing some stealth and tracking them back to their source, you eventually find a toy box, which upon jumping inside reveals another world. What makes this chapter so distinct, aside from its theme being completely original to this game, is the fact that you have to constantly return to Toad Town to return stolen items. You'll then bring something back with you that's likely to help you out in the toy box. This chapter introduces Watt, a little baby Spark, and I'll tell you what, she's the most OP partner in the entire game, as her default attack can pierce defense. She also has the power to completely break the Switch Online version of the game, so she's a powerful little baby Spark, isn't she? She doesn't say a whole lot, but I like her little binky. She's cute. Bouncing back and forth between the box and Toad Town can be a little annoying, though there is a sense of progress, so it doesn't bother me too much. But I do understand how people can see it as pretty annoying to go through this chapter on multiple consecutive playthroughs. Chapter 4 is not a personal favorite of mine, but it is distinct enough that I really enjoy it. Plus, it's got this optional fight with a Shy Guy that's really difficult, so if you want the challenge, go for it. Chapter 5 is basically themed to Yoshi's Island, and sees you befriending a Cheep Cheep named Sushi, who allows you to swim, something that for some reason Mario can't do on his own. She works hard dealing with these rambunctious little Yoshi babies, and she's got a heart of gold. With Sushi in your party, you cross paths with world-renowned archaeologist Colorado, spelled with a K. I gotta make that distinction because it's very important to his character. He finds himself getting into a lot of shenanigans and activating all kinds of booby traps and just basically being a nuisance, but inadvertently he kinda helps you, so there's that. He's a fan favorite character, but to me, my real favorite of the chapter is Big Yoshi.
Big Yoshi. Big Yoshi. Big Yoshi. Big Yoshi.
The boss of the chapter is a big piranha plant, and he's honestly the least interesting out of all the bosses in the game, but he's challenging enough. We move on to chapter 6, which is the other controversial chapter of the game, and this one I'm more inclined to agree with. Before you can even start the chapter, you need to have found the 4 special seeds, which are located in each of the previous chapters, excluding the first and the 4th. Taking place in a flowery garden, Chapter 6 sees you branching out into one of 6 possible directions, trying to bring back the sunshine that the plants need to survive. The problem is that exploration is really tedious and forces you to do quite a bit of backtracking. You also need to sacrifice some of your measly 10 item slots to hold items that are necessary for story progression, and that's kind of annoying. You meet Lackluster, who's cool. He's got them shades. What else do I need to say? You also move a little faster when you're riding on his cloud. Hell yeah. He's a chill guy. You actually have to fight him before you can add him to your party. That's different. I like that. It sucks that the rest of the chapter's so frustrating. Lackluster is the last partner that you befriend, and not long after that, you beat the chapter's boss, a giant cloud. He is another boring character, but his boss fight is pretty challenging. So much so that I actually died during this boss fight, so there you go. That's something. Chapter 7 is the Ice chapter, which is made more distinct by the fact that a penguin literally fucking dies. Upon discovering the dead penguin, his wife enters the room and Mario gets framed for his murder, meaning you have to explore the area and clear your name. Hey, that sounds kind of familiar. You eventually remember that this game got an E rating, so it turns out that the mayor, who we thought was dead, is actually okay. Anyway, you go to this temple, which is probably one of my favorite dungeons in the whole game. It's got this mirror that you go to the other side of, and it's like, whoa, and it really messes with your brain, and you fight an ice wizard. Take him down, and we've rescued all of the star spirits. One final trek up to Star Haven, and we fly up to Bowser's castle for the final confrontation. What follows is a long series of challenges and a great many battles that call upon every ability in Mario and his friends' arsenal. Eventually, you make your way up to Peach's castle, climb up, and have the final battle. Bowser gets big, and it's pretty good stuff. Again, the game does rely on a lot of the typical biomes of grass, desert, beach/jungle, lava, volcanoes, ice, and cloud worlds as locations that you visit, and it does feel like a bit of a step back compared to Super Mario RPG, which had a lot more unique locations, but there are also some more distinct areas in Paper Mario, like Shy Guy's Toy Box, Tubba Blubba's Mansion, the Flower Fields, and Star Haven. The sequel went even harder with the unique locations, so I won't fault this game for lacking in that department. If anything, I think it makes this game feel a bit more special. I like that it takes an established Mario world and fleshes it out more than what we would typically see in the platformers. The world of Paper Mario is a cohesive whole, and it's always fun to see how generic enemies or NPCs from those platformers have been fleshed out to be more diverse and have different looks and personalities. Not every Goomba is evil, and they don't all look the same either. Really makes you think about all the Goombas that you casually flatten in the mainline games, doesn't it? That's another big part of what's so beloved about this game, the fact that it fleshes out the Mario universe and puts more of an emphasis on story and characters. Admittedly, the plot of this game is pretty run-of-the-mill, with the basic take down Bowser and collect the MacGuffins plot, but the story is enhanced by its characters and writing. Each chapter is effectively its own little self-contained story, and there is no single really good chapter, but they're all solid and pretty enjoyable. I enjoy these characters, and there are a lot of memorable faces. Junior Troopa with his absurd rivalry with Mario, Buzzer who's just totally fooled when you tell him that you're Luigi and not Mario, Colorado who keeps getting into a bunch of wacky shenanigans, not to mention all of your partners who are pretty much all entertaining and enjoyable, though they sadly don't do anything in the story after joining your party and leaving the chapter that you meet them in, aside from occasionally responding to NPC dialogue since Mario himself is mute. We also have really good writing and characterization for the returning Mario characters. Luigi was given depth and personality for the first time ever, and he's real jealous of the fact that Mario gets to go on fun adventures while he has to stay at home. You can even invade his privacy and read his diary, which foreshadows Luigi's Mansion, the game that defined Luigi. In between each chapter, you'll cut to a section where you see what's happening from Peach's perspective. She does sadly go from being an active party member in Mario RPG to damsel in distress in this game, but she does still have agency, and you get to play as her, sneaking around the castle to gather intel. The way you get that intel to Mario is thanks to this little baby spirit named Twink, the femboy representation we've always wanted. Bowser is the main antagonist, and he's pretty entertaining. The guy is very full of himself, and his hubris definitely gets to him. I like that he's made to be intimidating at the start of the game, since you have to fight him and inevitably lose because you're not strong enough. This makes it satisfying when you do eventually fight him in the same hallway and actually win. Kammy Koopa is an original character who's Bowser's right hand, and honestly, I forget that she doesn't appear in the mainline games. She fits in that well, and I'm really sad that later games replace her with a generic Magic Koopa. Even the movie's guilty of this. The Kammy Koopa erasure will not stand. Lastly, of course, we have Mario. Mario is a silent protagonist. Don't stare too much into those soulless beady eyes or you'll have your soul turned into paper. Mario is the one doing heroics, but he's not very much of a character, though that's kind of a thing that you'll notice with all of the Paper Mario games. I'd argue that he's the most blank slate in this game, but the other games aren't doing a whole lot better in this department. While it would be nice for him to have a bit more personality, the supporting cast definitely picks up the slack. What the game lacks in narrative complexity, it more than makes up for with its charm. And charm is a big part of the game's identity. Its memorable characters, well-balanced and easy to understand gameplay, and of course, its visual identity and sound. It's all in the name. Paper Mario has a very unique visual presentation that's distinct compared to any other Mario or even Nintendo game. The closest to it I can think of is probably something like Yoshi's Story. The Nintendo 64 isn't known for well-aged graphics, with most of the games having aged far worse than games that came out on the previous console, and that's because pixel art is timeless. Polygons, not so much. Paper Mario, by contrast, has aged very gracefully. It does show its age in many respects, but compared to other big 3D games on the console, this game looks amazing. And it's all thanks to the art style that emulates the look of a pop-up storybook. This visual design aesthetic came about when the developers were put in the difficult situation of wanting to make a sequel to Super Mario RPG that didn't look like a sequel to that game. The devs weren't keen on using 3D models or redoing the style that they had for the first game, so this is how this game's visual aesthetic came to be. Early on, you could even see sprites pulled right out of Super Mario World used as temporary placeholders. And honestly, that style could have also looked great, but I'm glad that they went with this style. Aside from being used as a framing device and being the visual identity of the game, many argue that the paper aspect isn't leaned into all that much, aside from the occasional gag and the game's marketing. I can see why many feel this way, and there is some truth to the fact that the game doesn't lean into the paper part of things as much as later games in the series do. I largely attribute this to the game's Japanese name being different. There, it's called Mario Story, a reference to its storybook nature. After this game, the Japanese titles would also use paper in the name, with Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door being known as Paper Mario RPG in Japan. More on that when we talk about the Thousand Year Door in Chapter 2. Back to the point I'm trying to make. While paper isn't used as a gimmick in gameplay, papercraft still matters to this game's identity. The stage presentation framing, the way Kamek is taped into the story in a clever fourth wall break at the beginning, the way background elements during battle are attached like they're stage props, the way houses fold out of the way to let you peer inside. It might be mostly in the background, but it's still there. It's always been there. And the fact that the Nintendo 64 was able to make a game that looks like this is still something worth commending. My partner Noodly Boo, who doesn't play a lot of video games, was watching me play this one, and she was shocked when I told her that this was a Nintendo 64 game. So I think that speaks for itself. I'd say my only real issue with the game visually is this letterboxed aspect ratio that leaves a big border around the screen. And to make my point more clear, this is what the game looked like for me while playing on Nintendo Switch Online. By default, this border is always there, and it's just big enough to kind of irritate me. Through the power of editing, I was able to get rid of all that nonsense, so there you go. This is what the game should look like. Before I continue with this retrospective, I should also note that for each of the games that I cover, I plan on playing on official Nintendo hardware wherever I can. I chose the Nintendo Switch Online version of the game because I wanted to test it out, and I figured that this would be the most relevant way to play the game today, especially for people who are watching this that maybe haven't played this game and want to give it a try. I've also played the game on both Wii and Wii U, and it works really well on those platforms, arguably even better because they don't have the weird performance issues that the Switch has during two specific instances. One being where you have a lower frame rate on the menus, and another which basically makes it impossible to perform action commands during the boss fight in Chapter 5. It's still doable, but a lot harder here. But aside from those two instances, the game runs and sounds pretty good. Speaking of sound, the music also deserves a highlight. So, I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of this game's soundtrack, and by that, I mean I don't actively listen to any tracks from the game outside of the context of playing it, which I guess is a metric that I use to determine how much I like a soundtrack. But with that being said, I think this soundtrack is really good, and it suits this game perfectly. It sets a tone and vibe unlike anything in the games to come after. It's really soft and whimsical, with a general quality that's hard to pin down, so I'll play a few examples for you and hopefully they'll help you understand what I mean. I'd say that while I'm still not the biggest fan of the game's soundtrack, many of these themes still manage to get stuck in my head. The soundtrack is very memorable. You gotta give it credit for that, right? Special shout out to the theme that plays in Chapter 8, which does one of my favorite things ever in video game music, as it starts soft, but adds more instruments as you ascend up the castle. Adaptive music like this is one of my favorite things, and later games in the series would take this to the next level. Also, the castle theme in general is probably my favorite piece of music in the entire soundtrack. I love this game. A lot. But with that being said, no game is perfect, and I do have a few critiques to mention before we wrap up discussion on Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64. You know, going forward, I should probably just refer to this as Paper Mario 64 because it's probably gonna get very confusing after this, so that's what I'm gonna do. Anyway, While the pacing is generally very good, the game's combat is really boring up until you gain the ability to perform action commands just before Chapter 1. And even then, I would argue that it doesn't start to become engaging until Chapter 2. The early game battles make me feel like I'm just kind of going through the motions. There's also the backtracking in Chapter 4, which I've already talked about, and the messy layout combined with backtracking in Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is easily the worst one in the game, and the music also doesn't help. But that's just my opinion. There's also this puzzle that I got stuck on even though I played this game several times. I just felt like an idiot after I couldn't figure it out, but eventually I did, so yippee. But yeah, aside from those low points in the game, I'd say that the pacing in Paper Mario 64 is consistent and engaging. The game also does a decent job of respecting your time and lets you mash through dialogue pretty quickly. Much faster than a lot of the later games in the series, I'll tell you that. Being able to mash through dialogue is something I greatly appreciated. You can only hold 10 items at a time, but the game is balanced well enough that you won't always need the 10 items, though I don't like the game of musical chairs that you have to play when you want to trade out an item that you don't want so that you can acquire a new, better item. It's a bit of a mess, but at least the game has an option to let you do that in the first place. There's gotta be a better way to streamline the system. The sound that plays when you're in peril, that's annoying. I don't like it. Shut up. This game also does something that a lot of other JRPGs do that I don't really like, which is that after beating the final boss and reopening your save file, you get placed right before the final boss, effectively meaning that there's not really a way to 100% the game and there are no optional quests after that. I'm not a big fan of when games do this, as it makes me feel really incomplete. I like the closure that you get when you're able to explore games after conquering the final boss, but that's just me. There's also not really much of a reward for 100%ing the game, so I didn't bother. I also didn't 100% any of these games, because that's not something that I typically do. I'm not Gerard. If you want to know what that experience is like, just go watch his videos. If you play the Thousand Year Door and go back to this game, it might be difficult to do so, as a lot of the things that were added in that game are, of course, not here. But I wouldn't say that that's a criticism of this game per se. Just because adding sprinkles to ice cream makes the experience better, it doesn't mean that the solo ice cream experience is bad. And that's how I feel about this game. I acknowledge the many ways in which this game's design was improved in its sequel, but even so, this game still holds up and it's still worth playing, even for those who have played the Thousand Year Door, especially if you've played the Thousand Year Door. It's always fun to see where a series got its start, and fortunately, this beginning to our saga is an incredibly well put together experience that I'll likely end up returning to again many times in the future. Content creators online like Strider7X have shown what depth is really hiding in the game, and the modding scene has made some really fascinating stuff for the more hardcore crowd. If you're looking to play Paper Mario today, which you should, your best option is probably going to be the Nintendo Switch. The game, of course, originally launched on the Nintendo 64 and was re-released on the Wii Virtual Console and Wii U Virtual Console. Both versions are dead now unless you can track down a Wii or Wii U with these games already installed, so original hardware, or Switch, is what you've got as far as playing the game officially. But if you've already played through this game, or maybe you plan on playing it in the future, my recommendation is to get your ROM onto a PC and emulate the game with Master Kalula's texture pack. This is a still in progress mod that's currently being worked on, with different versions being put out pretty frequently, and it completely transforms the look of the game, bringing it up to the standards of the most recent games in the series. I'm not exaggerating. It's frankly incredible that a simple texture pack can make a Nintendo 64 game look modern. I'll link to Master Kalula's video on how to set up this mod in the description down below. Definitely check that out. It's an awesome way to play through the game. And it's most likely how I'm going to be playing this game in the future as well. And with that, I feel like I've said about as much as I feel needs to be said about this game as of right now. Paper Mario, for as beloved and revered as it is, I think is still a tad underrated. Though maybe the fact that I played it before TTYD is the real reason I'm able to see it this way. Regardless, every time I feel the urge to return to Mario's first paper adventure, I'm always ushered back to a warm and cozy place that never ceases to bring me comfort. And while the journey ahead is certainly going to be turbulent and complicated, I'm ready to face it because I played a damn good game. And the next game that I'm about to play is also a pretty damn good game. So, yeah, I guess that's how I feel about Paper Mario. So what now? Wait a minute, what's this? Wow, it actually worked. So then I guess I'll collect it. And so, JJ completed the discussion of Paper Mario and gathered the first of the heart-shaped trinkets. But still, 5 remained, and the journey was only just beginning. Hey, thanks for watching the video. This project is taking a lot out of me, and I've only talked about one game so far, so we've still got a lot of ground to cover. If you feel like supporting the work that I do, I'd greatly appreciate a subscribe, like, and possibly even you joining my Patreon if you can. If you do, you can become a Zillennial Apprentice for $5 a month and get your name featured in my videos, plus early access to ad-free versions, and you can join an exclusive Discord group and vote in special polls. Even if you're just watching, I greatly appreciate you, and I'm excited to continue this journey very soon. My original plan was to just have one really long video where I talk about all the games, but I quickly realized that the scope for this project was kind of overwhelming, and it would be a lot easier for me to get this out if I split it up into individual chunks. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also eventually planning on releasing a complete version that compiles all 6 parts into a single video, telling the full complete story. So look out for that once I inevitably get to chapter 6. I'm basically going to be releasing these 2 parts at the same time. Anyway, with all that being said, part 2 should be releasing in the next week or 2, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice day.